Hey San hey, I am PixelPia, and today I'm going to talk about something that is maybe more important than you first think about, and that is podcast art. They say that you never get a second chance of a first impression. Many people find podcasts by searching in their podcast app, and the first thing they will see is your podcast art. So that is, so to say, their first impression of your podcast. So it's important to really try to make podcast art that reflects the content of your podcast. Tonight, I'm going to talk about 10 different aspects of creating podcast art. Let's start by talking about some technical things, the dimensions. Everything here comes from Apple Podcast, which is the norm for most podcast apps, and this is what you should follow. So when it comes to the size of your podcast art, it has to be 1 by 1, it has to be square, and it can be between 1400 by 1400 or up to 3000 by 3000 pixels. It should be set to dots per inches at 72 dpi. If you're working in a graphics program like Photoshop or something like that, make sure you set it to 72 dpi and make sure you use RGB instead of CMYK, which is more for print. It also has to be up till 500 megabytes. And if it is larger than that, you have to compress it. And then, of course, you have to make it look good in all different sizes, because each podcast app show different sizes of your art. So that was the technical side. Now let's talk about content. First of all, as I said, it is important that your art reflects the content your podcast is about. If you do a podcast about animals, for example, it's about dogs. You shouldn't have a cat on your podcast art. Remember that this is the first impression, and if you can create art that clearly shows what the listener can expect from your podcast if they choose to click, then you have created great podcast art. Number 2 to think about is use minimal text. Remember, this will often be seen on mobile, which is the most common use of listening to podcasts, and they will usually be very small. So use as little text as possible. Somewhere I read someone saying maximum 7 words. I don't know how true that is, and it depends on size and fonts. It's also important to remember no explicit language or pictures. They will not be accepted at many podcast software. And talking about fonts, let's think about what fonts, our typography. Use no more than 2 different fonts in your art. And if you are using 2, it is recommended that one of the fonts is a serif font and the other one a sans serif. And as I said, don't crowd your art with text. Make sure your text is readable in all sizes, and avoid text that is visual distracting. Very often script can be hard to read, or if it's text that decorated, a font with decorations on it, avoid those. Keep it as clean as possible. Next thing to think about, and this is in general with one exception, avoid imagery that is podcast related, like microphones, pop filters, and all of that, unless your podcast is specifically about podcasting. Remember, podcast is your chosen medium to use. It is not the subject. Your art should easily convey the subject of your podcast. Then I want to talk about branding. And when I talk about branding, I'm not talking about having a logo, for example. This can be part of your branding, but I'm talking about using the similar color scheme, similar images on all types of platforms. When you create your podcast art, and this is today I'm talking about the art for the whole podcast, then you can do separate art using the same criteria for each episode, but I'm talking about the general podcast art. And you will probably interact to on website, building a website maybe, or on social media, and use the same color scheme and the same fonts and the same imagery on all different media where you will promote your podcast. That is what I mean by consistent branding. And your logo, if you have one, can of course be a part of that branding. When you are creating your podcast art, it's very important that you use high resolution images, because when you compress, which you usually have to do, you don't want your imagery to be pixelated. And remember, I said when we talked about the technical parts that your podcast art must be 500 megabytes or less. So you need to compress it. And talking about staying within your brand, create a color scheme. Make sure that you take notes about which color are included in your color scheme. 2 or 3 colors usually are enough. And write down the hex number and the RGB numbers for your chosen colors so you can reuse them on all platforms.